A place for a soul to mend must first be broken. Please, the woman whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves against the vast, unending wind. I'll take him. The stagecoach driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of indifference, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He gestured with a thumb toward the figure slumped on the wagon's bench, a man folded into himself, all sharp angles and worn fabric. The silence that followed was heavier than the gray sky pressing down on the plains. It was a silence filled with judgment, pity, and the cold calculus of survival. This was not the man she had been promised, not the sturdy partner her advertisement had requested, but a collection of rags and bones held together by a weary spirit. The narrator knew, even if she did not, that a choice made from desperation can sometimes be the first step toward a grace one could never have planned. The man, whose name she did not yet know, did not look up. He seemed to be studying the splintered floorboards of the stagecoach as if they held the answers to a question he'd long forgotten how to ask. His hands, resting on his knees, were raw and calloused, but they were still. They did not tremble. Alara noticed that. She noticed the stillness in him, a profound quiet that seemed to absorb the prairie's howling wind and the driver's sneering contempt. Her son, Samuel, a small boy of 5 with his late father's serious eyes, clutched her skirt. He was not afraid of the ragged man, only of the tension that coiled in the air, thick and suffocating. "Suit yourself, ma'am," the driver grunted, untying a meager bindle and tossing it to the ground. It landed with a soft, pathetic thud. "Payment's been settled by the agency. He's your problem now." With that, he cracked his whip, and the stagecoach lurched away, churning up a cloud of ochre dust that momentarily obscured the world. As it settled, the three of them were left alone on the raw, open land, standing before the faint trail that led to her homestead. The man in rags finally lifted his head. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, shadowed and deep. He looked at her, then at the boy, and a flicker of something. Not apology, not shame, but a profound and ancient weariness passed through them. He had expected to be sent back. He had expected to be discarded. He had not expected the quiet resolve in her voice. Alara took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. Her farm was failing. The well was temperamental, the north fence was down, and the loneliness was a physical weight she carried in her bones. She had gambled her last dollars on a hope, and this was the result. A broken man. But her son was watching, his small hand still tight in her skirt. For him, she would not show fear or disappointment. She would show strength. "Come on," she said, her voice stronger now. She did not offer him a hand. She simply turned and started walking toward the silhouette of her small cabin and barn, a lonely punctuation mark in the endless sentence of the plains. She did not look back to see if he was following. She trusted the desperation she saw in his eyes, a mirror to her own. After a moment, she heard the crunch of his worn boots on the dirt behind her. He stayed. The walk to the homestead was a study in silence. The wind was the only thing that spoke, whispering through the tall, dry grass with a mournful sound. Elias. He had not yet offered his name, but it was his, kept his eyes on the horizon, on the bruised purple of the distant mountains. He measured the distance between himself and the woman and child, a respectful space that spoke of a long acquaintance with being unwanted. He saw the state of her land without needing to inspect it. He saw the leaning fence posts, the patch of ground where a garden had tried and failed, the way the shingles on the barn roof curled up like parched tongues. He saw a struggle that was as plain as the hunger in his own belly. He had come here expecting nothing more than a roof and a meal, a temporary stay against the finality of ruin. He had not expected the quiet dignity of the woman, the way she walked with her back straight, as if defying the very sky to crush her. Alara felt his gaze on her back, but she did not turn. Her mind was a whirlwind of practicalities. Where would he sleep? What would he eat? The barn was the only answer. It was dry enough, and there was a pile of old blankets in the tack room. It was more than he likely had before. She steeled herself against the welling of pity. Pity was a luxury, a soft emotion she couldn't afford. She needed a worker, a pair of strong hands. What she had received was another mouth to feed, another soul to worry over. The thought was bitter. When they reached the cabin, she stopped at the porch. "The barn," she said, pointing. "There are blankets in the room to the left. You can clean up at the pump." He gave a single, sharp nod, his eyes briefly meeting hers. He did not argue. He did not ask for more. He turned and walked toward the barn. His shoulders slumped but his stride even. Samuel watched him go, his thumb finding its way to his mouth. "Is he going to fix the fence, Mama?" the boy asked, his voice small. "We'll see, sweetheart," Alara said, smoothing his hair. "We'll see." Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the main room. A stone fireplace, swept clean, dominated one wall. Her late husband, John, had built this cabin with his own hands. Every log, every stone was a memory. The rocking chair by the hearth, its wood worn smooth, was where he had rocked Samuel to sleep. Now it sat empty, a silent accusation. She moved to the stove and began to prepare a meal, her movements methodical and automatic. A thin stew of potatoes and salted pork. It was all they had. She cooked enough for 3. The decision was not a conscious one. It was an instinct, a stubborn refusal to be the kind of person who would let a man starve, no matter how great her disappointment. When the stew was ready, she ladled 2 bowls for herself and Samuel. She hesitated, then filled a third, larger bowl. She took it, along with a piece of hard bread and a tin cup of water, and walked to the barn. The large doors were slightly ajar. She peered inside. The last of the evening light slanted through the gaps in the walls, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He was by the water pump, his shirt off, splashing icy water over his face and neck. His back was a landscape of scars, old and new, pale lines crisscrossing his sun-darkened skin. He was thin, too thin, but there was muscle there, corded and tight from a life of hard labor. He was not as broken as he had first appeared. He was simply worn down to the bone. He must have sensed her presence, because he stilled, then slowly reached for his tattered shirt. He turned, pulling it on, his face unreadable in the dim light. She held out the bowl. "Here." He looked at the food, then at her. He did not move for a long moment. It was as if he was trying to understand the gesture, to find the catch, the price attached to this simple act of sustenance. Finally, he reached out and took the bowl. His fingers brushed against hers, and she felt the rough, callous skin, the deep, abiding cold that had settled into him. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. His voice was raspy from disuse. She nodded, unable to speak, and retreated back to the warmth of her cabin. She ate her own meal in silence, listening to the sound of Samuel's spoon scraping against his bowl. Later, as she tucked her son into his small bed, he looked up at her. "The man is sad, Mama." Alara paused, her hand on his forehead. "Yes, I think he is. Are you sad?" "Sometimes," she admitted. She kissed his cheek. "Now sleep." She sat in the rocking chair for a long time that night, the fire dying down to embers. She did not rock. She just sat, listening to the wind rattling the window panes, the sound of her own breathing, and the profound, overwhelming silence of the man in her barn. A contract had been made, not of paper and ink, but of a shared glance, a bowl of stew, and the unspoken acknowledgement of their mutual desperation. She had taken him in. He had stayed. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, a silent, unwritten agreement. The man, who she learned was named Elias, rose before the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gray. Alara would wake to the sound of the axe splitting wood, a steady, percussive beat that was both reassuring and unsettling. He never asked for instruction. He simply saw what needed to be done and did it. The first day, it was the woodpile, which he stacked with a precision that bordered on art. The next, he began mending the north fence, the one that bordered the vast, empty lands belonging to Mr. Croft, the cattle baron who was slowly swallowing up all the small homesteads in the valley. Elias worked with a relentless, quiet energy. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of labor. He dug out the rotted posts, his back straining, the muscles in his arms cording with the effort. He stretched the wire taut, his hands working deftly despite their raw state. Alara watched him from the kitchen window as she kneaded dough for their daily bread. She watched him and she waited. She waited for him to ask for payment, to complain about the meager food, to reveal the flaw she was certain must be hiding beneath his silent competence. But he asked for nothing. Their interactions were minimal, stripped down to the bare necessities. She would leave his breakfast on the porch steps, a chunk of bread, a piece of salt pork, and he would take it without a word. At midday, she would do the same with a bowl of whatever stew or soup she had made. They ate separately, he on the barn steps, she at her table with Samuel. They were two separate orbits, circling the same small center of survival. The silence between them was a living thing, a third presence on the homestead. It was a language of its own, full of suspicion, caution, and the faintest glimmers of a reluctant respect. Samuel was the only one who dared to cross the invisible line. He would sit on the porch, a safe distance away, and watch Elias work. The boy was fascinated by the man's skill, by the way he could coax a straight line from a roll of tangled wire, the way he handled the heavy sledgehammer with such control. One afternoon, Samuel ventured closer, holding a small, smooth stone he had found by the creek. He held it out to Elias. "It's a good skipping stone," he announced. Elias stopped his work. He looked down at the boy, then at the stone in his small, outstretched hand. He did not smile, but the hard lines around his eyes seemed to soften for a fraction of a second. He wiped his dusty hand on his trousers and gently took the stone. He turned it over in his palm, his thumb rubbing its cool surface. "It is," he agreed, his voice low and gravelly. "A fine one." He didn't offer to go to the creek to skip it. He didn't engage in conversation. He simply acknowledged the boy's gift, then carefully placed the stone on a flat fence post before turning back to his work. But for Samuel it was enough. He ran back to the cabin, his face bright. "He liked my stone, Mama. He said it was a fine one." Alara felt a strange pang in her chest, a complex mixture of gratitude and fear. The man was quiet, he was a hard worker, and he was not unkind to her child. But he was a stranger, a man with a past etched onto his back in scars. A man who had arrived with nothing but the clothes he wore and a silence as vast as the prairie itself. Trust was a seed that had been planted in barren ground. She did not know if it could grow. One evening, as dusk settled, the handle of her main water bucket broke. The wood, old and brittle, simply gave way, sending the bucket crashing to the ground. She sighed, the small setback feeling like a monumental defeat. She would have to use the smaller pail, making twice the trips from the well. It was just one more thing. The next morning, when she went to the well, the bucket was sitting by the pump. A new handle, carved from a sturdy piece of hickory, had been fitted into place. The carving was smooth, the joins seamless. It was stronger than the original had ever been. She looked toward the barn, where Elias was already at work on the far side of the property, his back to her. He had seen the broken bucket. He had fixed it in the quiet hours of the night, by lantern light, expecting no thanks, no acknowledgement. The act was a small rebellion against her suspicion. It was a gesture that spoke louder than any words he might have offered. Said, "I am here to help. I am here to mend what is broken." She ran her hand over the smooth wood of the new handle, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. It was a fragile thing, this budding trust, as delicate as a spider's web, but it was there. She carried the full bucket back to the cabin, the weight feeling somehow lighter than it had the day before. The routine was their foundation, and these small, silent acts of care were the first stones being laid upon it. A storm was brewing on the horizon, both in the sky and in their quiet lives, but for now, there was the steady rhythm of work, the comfort of a mended bucket, and the slow, cautious thawing of a frozen heart. The days shortened, and the wind developed a sharper edge, carrying the first bite of winter from the mountains. The sky was often a sheet of iron gray, pressing down on the land. Elias worked relentlessly, as if trying to outrun the coming cold. He finished the fence, then moved on to the barn roof. Replacing the curled shingles with new ones, he split himself from a fallen cottonwood. He insulated the walls of the barn with packed sod and mud, a trick of the plains people, ensuring the lone milk cow and 2 chickens would survive the winter. He did all this with a quiet, focused intensity that left little room for anything but the task at hand. Alara found herself watching him more and more. She saw the way he favored his left leg when he was tired, the deep lines of concentration etched between his brows as he worked. She saw the exhaustion in his shoulders at the end of the day, an exhaustion he never once complained about. His silence was no longer just an absence of words. It was a wall he had built around himself, brick by careful brick. But now she could see the cracks. One afternoon, she found a small, crudely carved wooden bird sitting on the porch rail. Its wings were outstretched, its head cocked as if listening to a secret song. It was simple, but it was rendered with a surprising tenderness. She knew without asking who had made it. She picked it up, the wood still warm from the carver's hands. Just then, Samuel came running out of the cabin. His eyes lit up when he saw the bird. "For me?" he breathed. Alara looked toward the barn. Elias was nowhere in sight, but she felt his presence. He was watching, she was sure of it. He was offering another piece of himself, not to her, but to her son. It was a safer transaction. A gift given to a child asks for nothing in return but a moment of joy. "I think so," she said softly, handing the bird to Samuel. The boy cradled it in his hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He spent the rest of the afternoon making it fly through the air, providing his own sound effects of wind and birdsong. The sound of his innocent play was a bright thread woven into the gray tapestry of the day. That evening, when she took Elias his dinner, she found him sitting on the barn steps, sharpening an axe blade with a whetstone. The rhythmic shing, shing, shing was a lonely sound in the growing dark. She set the plate down beside him. "The bird was beautiful," she said, her voice quiet. "Thank you." He didn't stop the motion of his hands, but he paused his stroke for a beat. "The boy, he's a good boy." It was the most he had said to her in weeks. It was an opening, a small door pushed ajar. She wanted to ask him more. She wanted to ask where he learned to carve, where he came from, what sorrows had carved those lines on his face. But the questions caught in her throat. The wall was still there, and she was afraid to push against it too hard, afraid it might crumble and bring whatever it was holding back down on top of them both. So she just nodded. "Yes, he is." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "There's a storm coming, ma'am. A bad 1 inch. She looked at the sky. The clouds were thick and bruised, hanging low and heavy. The wind had died down to an eerie stillness. The air felt charged, expectant. "I know. I've been getting ready. You should bring more wood inside," he said. "All of it. And check the seal on that north window. The wind will come from there." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a quiet command born of experience. He knew the land. He knew its tempers. She found herself trusting his judgment without question. They spent the last hour of daylight working together, for the first time, not in their separate spheres but as a team. He carried the heavy loads of split logs, and she stacked them by the hearth until they reached the ceiling. He showed her how to mix a paste of mud and grass to seal the gaps in the window frame. They worked in their usual silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of shared purpose, of 2 people bracing for the same fight. As the first flakes of snow began to fall, fat and wet and heavy, she stood at her door and looked at him. He was pulling the great barn doors shut, preparing to weather the storm in his cold solitude. A sudden, fierce protectiveness washed over her. It was absurd. He was the stranger, the man she should fear. But the thought of him alone in that barn while the blizzard raged felt fundamentally wrong. "Elias," she called out. His name felt strange on her tongue. He turned, a dark silhouette against the swirling white. "You can't stay in there," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Come inside. You can sleep by the fire." He stood motionless for a long time, the snow beginning to coat his shoulders. She saw the conflict in his stance, the deep-seated instinct to remain apart warring with the simple human need for warmth. The wind howled, whipping her hair across her face, and she held her ground, waiting for his answer. The storm was coming, and it was about to force them together, to break down the last of their carefully constructed walls. He gave a slow, hesitant nod. He pulled his thin coat tighter around himself and walked across the yard, his boots already sinking into the rapidly accumulating snow. He stepped inside the cabin, bringing the cold and the wild scent of the storm with him. The door shut behind him, and the world outside disappeared into a vortex of white. The cabin, which had always felt so empty, suddenly seemed impossibly small. The blizzard descended with a fury that seemed personal, a malevolent force trying to tear their small shelter from the face of the earth. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the window panes and finding every tiny crack in the log walls to send in drafts of icy air. Elias had been right. The main force of the storm came from the north, and the mud and grass seal he had applied to the window held firm. Inside, a strange and fragile truce had been declared. Elias sat on a low stool by the hearth, his back to the room, feeding logs into the fire. He seemed to be trying to make himself as small as possible, to take up the least amount of space in her home. Alara sat at the table, mending one of Samuel's shirts, her fingers working automatically while her mind raced. The silence was no longer one of distance but of proximity, charged with an awkward intimacy. Samuel, oblivious to the tension, was asleep in his bed, the wooden bird clutched in his hand. Hours passed. The storm only intensified. Sometime after midnight, a small cough came from Samuel's bed. Then another. Alara put down her sewing and went to him. His forehead was hot to the touch. A familiar, sickening dread coiled in her stomach. It had started this way with John, a cough, a fever, and then a rapid decline that no poultice or prayer could halt. "Mama," Samuel whimpered, his eyes glassy. "I'm cold." She pulled the thickest quilt up to his chin, but he began to shiver violently. His teeth chattered. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She was alone. The storm had cut her off from the world, from any possibility of help. She worked frantically, doing all the things she had done for John. She brewed a willow bark tea, but Samuel was too weak to drink much of it. She soaked cloths in cool water and placed them on his forehead, but the fever seemed to burn them dry in minutes. His breathing grew shallow and ragged. Elias had not moved from his spot by the fire, but she knew he was listening. She could feel his stillness, his silent attention. She was a proud woman, a private woman. She did not ask for help easily, but as she watched her son's small body tremble, her pride crumbled into dust. She finally turned to the man by the fire, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." He rose slowly and came to the bed. He didn't hover or intrude. He simply looked down at Samuel, his face grim in the firelight. He gently laid the back of his rough hand against the boy's cheek. The gesture was surprisingly tender. "The fever's too high," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We need to bring it down. Now." He took control, not by force, but with a quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Get the snow bucket," he instructed, "and all the clean cloths you have." She moved without thinking, her fear making her obedient. He directed her to fill the cloths with snow, wrapping them into tight bundles. He then began to methodically place them around Samuel, at his neck, under his arms, in the crooks of his knees. "It will feel cold to him," Elias explained, his eyes never leaving the boy. "He'll fight it, but we have to keep him cool. The heat can cook the sense right out of a person." He spoke with a certainty that calmed the frantic beating of her heart. He had seen this before. He knew this enemy. They worked together through the long, dark hours, a silent, desperate team. He would murmur reassurances to the whimpering boy, his voice a steady, calming presence in the howling chaos of the storm. Alara would change out the melting snowpacks, her hands numb with cold and fear. At one point, as she knelt by the bed, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, he spoke. "I lost a sister this way," he said. His voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it over the wind. "She was 7. Fever came on just as fast. We didn't know what to do. We just kept her warm." He paused, the memory a heavy weight in the small room. "It was the wrong thing. We smothered the life right out of her, trying to keep her safe." The confession was a stark and brutal thing, a piece of his broken past offered up in the dim, flickering light. Alara looked at him, at the raw pain in his eyes, and she finally understood the source of his profound sadness. It wasn't just hardship. It was guilt, a guilt he had carried for years, a burden that had bent his shoulders and silenced his voice. In that moment, he was no longer a stranger, a ragged man from the stagecoach. He was a fellow traveler in the land of grief, someone who understood the unique agony of losing a loved one to the merciless whims of fate. She didn't offer words of comfort. She knew how hollow they would sound. Instead, she simply dipped another cloth into the bucket of snow, her movements mirroring his. They were bound together now, not by a contract or by proximity, but by a shared vigil, by the desperate, frantic hope for the small life breathing between them. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, the world had shrunk to the space around Samuel's bed, to the fight for a single, precious breath. He had stayed, and she, for the first time, was deeply, profoundly glad that he had. The night bled into a gray, featureless dawn. The storm's fury had abated, leaving behind a world buried in white, a profound and muffled silence. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, Samuel's shallow breathing, and the weary sighs of the 2 adults who had not slept. Sometime in the darkest hour, the fever had broken. Samuel's shivering had subsided, replaced by a deep, healing sweat. The glassy look in his eyes had softened, and he had finally fallen into a peaceful sleep. Alara sat in the rocking chair, which Elias had moved beside the bed, her hand resting on her son's chest, feeling the steady, miraculous rhythm of his heart. Relief had washed over her, so potent and overwhelming it left her weak and trembling. Elias was back on his stool by the fire, his shoulders slumped, the tension of the long night having drained the last of his energy. The firelight cast his face in shadow, but she could see the exhaustion carved into every line. He had not just helped. He had guided her, anchored her when her own fear threatened to pull her under. He had shared a piece of his own brokenness to give her strength. The silence that settled between them was new. It was not the cautious silence of strangers or the comfortable silence of routine. It was the deep, resonant silence of shared trauma, of a battle fought and won together. It held the weight of his confession and her unspoken gratitude. "Alara," he said, his voice rough. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded solid, real. She looked at him. "My husband, John," she began, the words coming slowly, hesitantly. It was a fever, too, in the spring. It took him in 3 days. She had not spoken of this to anyone. The grief was a private, walled-off garden she tended alone. But Elias had shown her his scars. Felt right to show him hers. "I did everything I could, everything the doctor in town said, but it wasn't enough. I thought." Last night, her voice trailed off. He nodded, understanding what she couldn't say. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss." He simply sat there, a witness to her pain, and the shared acknowledgement was more comforting than any empty phrase could have been. "You're a strong woman," he said after a long moment, "to manage this all on your own." "I wasn't on my own last night," she replied softly. "Thank you, Elias." He met her gaze across the room, and for the first time, the wall between them seemed to dissolve entirely. She saw not a vagrant, not a hired hand, but a man who had suffered, who had made mistakes, and who carried his burdens with a quiet, stoic grace. As the morning light grew stronger, they moved about the cabin with a new, unspoken understanding. He went out to check on the animals, wading through the chest-deep snow, while she made coffee and a thin porridge. When he returned, his face red from the cold, she gestured for him to sit at the table. Not on the stool by the fire, but at the table, with her. He hesitated, his old habits of self-effacement dying hard. But she looked at him, her expression leaving no room for refusal. He slowly sat down in the chair that had been John's. Felt both strange and right. She placed a steaming bowl of porridge and a cup of coffee in front of him. They ate in silence, but it was a companionable silence now, the kind shared by people who no longer needed words to understand one another. Later that day, Elias noticed the wobble in the leg of the old rocking chair. Without a word, he took it out to the porch along with his small toolkit. He spent the afternoon in the cold, clear air, carefully mending it. He reinforced the joint with a small wooden peg, sanded it smooth, and tested its strength until he was satisfied. He was not just fixing a piece of furniture. He was restoring a piece of her past, a symbol of her home. He was mending what was broken. When he brought it back inside, placing it by the hearth, warm and sturdy once more, Alara felt tears spring to her eyes. It was such a small thing, a wobbly chair, but it was everything. It was a testament to his quiet, observant nature, to his innate desire to heal and to build. That night, after Samuel was tucked in bed, breathing easily, she sat in the newly mended rocker. The motion was smooth, comforting, a rhythm she hadn't felt since before John had passed. Elias sat at the table, carving another small animal from a piece of scrap wood, this time a wolf, its head tilted back in a silent howl. "Where did you come from, Elias?" she asked, her voice gentle. He kept his eyes on his work, the knife moving deftly in his hands. "A place that didn't want me anymore," he said. "A farm in the east. My father's place. After he died, things fell apart." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The story was in the slump of his shoulders, the sadness in his eyes. He had lost his home, his family, his place in the world. He had been adrift until the stagecoach had deposited him, a piece of human flotsam, at her feet. She stopped rocking. "You have a place here," she said, the words as solid and true as the mended chair beneath her. "If you want it." He looked up from his carving, his hands stilling. He looked at her, at the warm fire, at the sleeping child in the next room. He looked at the home they had defended together against the storm. He didn't speak. He just gave a single, slow nod. The contract had been rewritten. He was no longer a man who had stayed. He was a man who belonged. Weeks passed, and the deep snows of the blizzard slowly melted under a strengthening sun, revealing a world washed clean. The homestead, once a place of solitary struggle, was now a place of shared labor. The unspoken arrangement solidified into a partnership. They fell into a new routine, one that was interwoven. They rose at the same time, ate at the same table, and worked side by side to prepare the farm for the spring planting. The transformation was slow, almost imperceptible on a day-to-day basis, but profound. The silence between them remained, but it was now a comfortable, trusted space, a language of understanding that required no translation. A shared glance across the field was enough to communicate the need for a tool. A simple nod at the end of the day was a recognition of a job well done. With the thaw came the need to go to town for supplies. The winter stores were nearly gone, and they needed seed for the spring planting, flour, salt, and other necessities. The trip was unavoidable. Alara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. The town, with its prying eyes and gossiping tongues, was a trial she had always dreaded. Facing it with Elias at her side felt both like a shield and a target. His presence was a comfort to her, but she knew how the townsfolk would see it, the desperate widow and the vagrant she'd taken in. They rode in the old buckboard, Elias holding the reins, his posture straight and steady. Samuel sat between them, chattering excitedly, clutching the wooden wolf. As they neared the town of Redemption, Alara could feel the change in the air. The open solitude of the plains gave way to the closed, watchful world of the small community. As soon as they pulled up to the general store, the whispers started. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, peered at them over her spectacles. Her lips pursed in disapproval. Two ranchers, loitering on the boardwalk, stopped their conversation to stare, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. Alara kept her head held high, her face a mask of serene indifference, but inside, she felt the familiar sting of humiliation. She had always been an outsider, the woman who lived too far out, who kept to herself. Her grief had made her a subject of pity. Her new arrangement made her a subject of scandal. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, a large, well-dressed man blocked their path. It was Mr. Croft, the cattle baron whose land surrounded her own like a hungry sea. He was a man who oozed a smug, predatory confidence, his wealth a weapon he wielded with casual cruelty. "Well, well, Mrs. Johansson," he said, his voice a low, condescending drawl. He tipped his hat in a mockery of respect, his eyes flicking dismissively over Elias. "I see you've found yourself some help." He let the word hang in the air, laden with insinuation. Alara's jaw tightened. "Mr. Croft, times must be harder than I thought," Croft continued, ignoring her cold tone. He looked directly at Elias, his lip curling in a sneer. "Hiring scarecrows now, are we? I trust you're paying him in table scraps." Elias stood perfectly still, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on a point just over Croft's shoulder. He did not rise to the bait. His stillness seemed to infuriate Croft more than any angry retort could have. "I've made you a generous offer for that parcel of yours, Alara," Croft said, his voice turning oily. "A woman alone with a boy to raise. It's no place for you, and certainly no place to be taking in stray dogs. Sell to me. I'll give you enough to get a decent start somewhere else. Somewhere more civilized." The public nature of the confrontation was designed to shame her, to break her will. The other townsfolk were now openly watching, their faces a gallery of morbid curiosity. Alara felt her cheeks burn. She opened her mouth to tell him to go to hell, to defend her choices, her home, her dignity. But before she could speak, Elias moved. It was a small, simple action. He stepped forward, closing the small gap between himself and Alara, and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. It was a gesture of possession, of protection, of unwavering solidarity. He then looked directly at Mr. Croft, and for the first time, the weariness in his eyes was replaced by a cold, hard fire. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring of the crowd with the clean, sharp edge of steel. "This is her land," he said, his words clear and deliberate. "And I am her husband." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Alara's own breath caught in her throat. He had not consulted her. He had not asked. He had simply made a declaration, a public stand that redefined their entire world in 2 short sentences. He wasn't finished. He held Croft's gaze, his grip on Alara's shoulder firm and reassuring. "You will address us both with respect, and you will not speak to my wife about her land again. Is that understood?" Croft was stunned into silence. He had expected a cowering vagrant, not this quiet, immovable man who claimed the widow as his own. He sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red, but the challenge in Elias's eyes was undeniable. Defeated and humiliated in front of the whole town, Croft gave a curt, angry nod, pushed past them, and stalked down the street. The crowd on the boardwalk began to disperse, their whispers now tinged with shock and a grudging respect. Elias's hand remained on Alara's shoulder, a warm, steady weight. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. He had defended her. He had claimed her. In that single public act, he had redeemed not only her dignity but his own. He was no longer a man in rags, a recipient of charity. He was a husband. He was a protector. He had drawn a line in the dust of that mean little town and dared anyone to cross it. He had chosen. The ride back to the homestead was as silent as the one that had brought them to town. But the quality of the silence had changed forever. It was no longer a space to be navigated with caution, but a shared vessel holding the weight of what had happened. Alara kept replaying the scene in her mind. Elias's hand on her shoulder, the cold fire in his eyes, the absolute certainty in his voice. I am her husband. He hadn't said it with passion or romance. He had said it like a fact, like a stone dropped into a deep well, the truth of it rippling outward. It was a moral declaration, a shield he had raised to protect her from the cruelty of the world. She should have been angry at his presumption. She should have been frightened by the finality of his words. Instead, she felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of safety she hadn't realized she'd been missing so desperately. When they arrived back at the cabin, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the yard. Elias lifted a sleeping Samuel from the buckboard and carried him inside, laying him gently on his bed. Alara followed, her movements slow and deliberate. She put away the supplies, the familiar actions of her routine, a comfort in the face of such a monumental shift. When she was done, she turned to find Elias standing by the door, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. He looked like the man who had first arrived, uncertain and expecting dismissal. I had no right, he said, his voice low, to speak for you like that. She walked toward him, stopping just a few feet away. She looked at his worn boots, his mended trousers, the strong, calloused hands that had rebuilt her fence and mended her son's cradle. She looked at the man who had faced down her deepest fears, both in the form of a blizzard and a bully. You had every right, she said softly. His head came up, his eyes searching hers, looking for the truth of her words. He found no anger there, no recrimination, only a quiet, steady acceptance. From that day on, everything was different. The pretense was gone. He was no longer the hired hand sleeping by the fire. He moved his few belongings, the bindle, the whetstone, the half-finished carvings, into the main room. He did not presume to enter her bedroom, but he was no longer a guest in the house. He was a part of it. He was home. Their work took on a new dimension. It was no longer about survival, it was about building. They were not just mending a broken-down farm. They were creating a future. They worked together in the fields, preparing the soil for the spring wheat. He showed her how to properly plow a straight furrow, and she showed him which wild herbs were good for seasoning and which for medicine. Their hands would sometimes brush as they worked, and a current of warmth would pass between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the new intimacy that was growing in the space his words had cleared. He began to repair the cabin itself. He replaced the leaking patch in the roof, shoring it up with new timbers. He planed the warped floorboards until they lay flat and even. He built a new, sturdy shelf for her preserves. Each nail he hammered, each board he sawed, was an affirmation of his declaration in town. This is our home. I am here to stay. The sound of laughter returned to the homestead. It started with Samuel, whose world was now complete. He had a mother who was safe and a man who was his protector, his teacher, his friend. Elias taught him how to fletch an arrow with a hawk's feather, how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to whittle his own small menagerie of wooden animals. The boys' delighted shouts echoed across the fields, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. Slowly, Alara began to laugh with him. At first, it was just a small smile, a quiet chuckle at something Samuel said. But one day, as Elias was trying to teach their stubborn cow to take a bucket from a new stall he'd built, the cow kicked the bucket over, drenching him from head to toe. He stood there, dripping and stunned, and Alara, watching from the porch, let out a full, genuine laugh. It was a sound she thought had died with John. Elias looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his own face, and the sound of her laughter was more beautiful to him than any birdsong. They were not just partners in labor anymore. They were building a family. From silence came warmth. From shared hardship came a home. The seasons turned, and the green shoots of spring wheat pushed through the dark, rich soil of the plains. The small garden they had planted together by the side of the cabin flourished, its neat rows a testament to their combined effort. The homestead was no longer a place of lack, but a place of quiet abundance. The house, once a shelter against loneliness, was now filled with the low murmur of conversation, the sound of Samuel's running feet, and the steady, comforting creak of the mended rocking chair. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the horizon, Alara sat on the porch, mending one of Elias's shirts. The fabric was worn but clean, and she took care with her stitches, her needle dipping in and out in a steady rhythm. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming prairie flowers. Samuel was asleep inside, his breathing soft and even. A profound sense of contentment settled over her, a feeling so foreign she had to consciously acknowledge it, to hold it in her mind and examine it. It was peace. Elias sat on the top step, cleaning a piece of tack leather with saddle soap. His movements were slow and methodical, his large hands gentle with the worn strap. He worked in a comfortable silence, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the vast, open landscape. The silence was their native tongue, a language richer and more honest than words could ever be. It spoke of shared memories, of the blizzard, of the fever, of the confrontation in town. It spoke of mutual respect, of a trust that had been earned through action, not promises. He finished his task and looked out at the fading light, his profile strong and stoic against the darkening sky. He had filled out since his arrival. The hollows in his cheeks were gone, and his shoulders, no longer slumped with weariness and guilt, were broad and straight. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet clarity. He had found his purpose not in running from his past, but in building a future. Without a word, he stood up, went inside, and returned with 2 tin cups of water from the bucket. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers. The simple gesture was imbued with a deep and abiding care. It was an act of service, of partnership. "I see you. I am here with you." She took the cup, her heart swelling with a quiet, powerful emotion. It was not the fiery, youthful passion she had shared with John. This was something different. It was a love that had grown slowly, in rocky soil, nurtured by kindness and resilience. It was a love as steady and enduring as the land itself. She took a sip of the cool water, the creak of the rocker the only sound between them. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the man he was, the man he had always been beneath the rags and the sorrow. He was a good man, kind man, a man who mended what was broken, whether it was a fence, a chair, or a heart. The town had seen a vagrant. She had seen a savior. He had arrived with nothing, yet he had given her everything. The coat he had worn that first day still hung on a hook inside the door. She had washed it and mended the tears, but she had not thrown it away. It was a reminder, a symbol of the journey they had taken from desperation to belonging. It was a testament to the fact that a person's worth is not measured by their possessions, but by the strength and integrity of their soul. It hung there not as a mark of his poverty, but as the first chapter in their story. He sat back down on the step, and she continued her mending, the simple domestic act a prayer of gratitude. The vast, lonely prairie no longer felt threatening. It was just the backdrop to the small, warm world they had built together. The stars began to appear, cold and distant, but she felt no chill. She reached out, her work forgotten in her lap, and laid her hand on his broad shoulder. He stopped his own quiet work and covered her hand with his. She stayed.